want to start today's long-form interview by playing for you a short excerpt of a recently released podcast called Heretic in the House. Have a listen.
In the past few years, Orthodox Jews have been getting some attention. On Netflix, in news stories, in memoirs, people are entranced by horror stories of oppressive Hasidic enclaves, their educational system, gender segregation. They want to hear tales of brave souls who managed to break free at tremendous personal cost. People get the impression that they understand these communities and those who rebel against them. But the reality is a lot more complicated than what you see on TV. And there are a great many stories that rarely get heard at all.
Heretic in the House is a 4-part podcast series by Naomi Seidman that explores the narratives of those who leave the Hasidic or Orthodox community, the narratives told by us, including myself who left, as well as about us, as well as how this reflects on the community that we come from. There's been so much media, as Naomi said, on this subject, but Heretic in the House took a very careful and very nuanced, multifaceted look at the topic. The podcast was divided in 4 episodes. The first episode is about telling the tale, the dramatic story of escape from the Hasidic community and why it is such a hot story that so many people want to hear. Episode 2 is about shunning, the often stereotype that those who leave are completely cut off from the world that they come from, and a look at, is that true? To what degree is that true? Episode 3 is called nebuch, which is a Yiddish word that is to say, oh, what a pity, reflecting the word often used by people in the community to describe those who leave, as in to say, what a pity this person left this beautiful lifestyle behind. And episode 4 is You're So Brave, which comes from the other side. Those on the outside often tell those who leave, you're so brave, and a look at what this means, how it is often perceived, and so on. I was actually one of many people who were interviewed for this podcast, and when I was interviewed, I had no idea what Naomi was planning to do with a podcast, and I think even Naomi, after everything, did not expect that the podcast would go off the way it did. It was absolutely a smash hit. I heard from so many people about it. In fact, many people showed up to my tours because of the podcast. And I think in general, it reflected a great hunger for a more thoughtful and nuanced conversation about the stories of those who leave these insular communities, as well as the communities themselves. And so I thought, since my own work on this YouTube channel is about this community as someone who has left and my view being very much colored by my journey, I thought it would be very relevant to continue the conversation by inviting Naomi to talk about her podcast for my YouTube channel. And this is the conversation, free form, we were just talking, that I am sharing with you today, and I hope you enjoy it. I heard so many regards about the podcast. I think the reason I wanted to talk to you about it is because I get asked about off the derech all the time. And I feel like the conversation is almost always so black and white. And what you did was something different. So I want to start by asking you, if maybe it's tall order, to summarize your podcast.
Okay. First of all, when you say you did, I mean, we did a little bit, right? I interviewed you and
That's true. That is
a few other people. And definitely that made a huge difference. But so there are 4 episodes. Should I just summarize the episodes?
Yeah. Also, however you would describe it.
It's basically a way to, the way I thought about it is, what if people understood how OTD people, OTD short for off the derech, what if they understood how we talk about it among ourselves? Like the sorts of things we talk about. So or at least I do. I mean, I don't want to speak for more people than me and the 4 people I interviewed, or however many it was. But the first episode is basically about how people are so curious about this story and why it sometimes feels kind of creepy to tell it, even though I do a lot. But I didn't actually in the podcast, and neither did you, which feels like a kind of victory, right? And the second episode was called Shunning, and it was about how people think that if you leave the very strict Orthodox world, your parents, your family will basically cut you off. And that does happen, but it doesn't happen quite as often as people seem to think it does. And mostly it's some other sort of halfway situation that I tried to describe. And then the third episode is called Nebuch, where I'm starting to use Yiddish words and letting people just be confused for a minute or two. And it's as a way of signaling that this is an insider discourse. And it's about how the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox world tends to see people who leave, which I think is probably very surprising for people on the outside, that they tend to see us as losers or like a little pathetic. And then often, I mean, again,
I'm surprised that people find it surprising because it's so intuitively.
Really? I think they think we're heroes.
That's right.
Which is the fourth episode, which is called You're So Brave, and about how that's how people on the outside think about us. You're so brave. You actually use that phrase as like people want to say that to us. They want to say it to you. And what it is that they don't understand when they're telling us that, and what it is that feels a little off about that. So those are the 4 episodes. I think I have like a lot more, but that's what it was. It was 4 episodes.
Are you going to come back with more episodes?
It's not entirely clear whether this is going to continue, whether like what's going to happen with the Hartman Institute, whether they're interested, whether someone else might be interested. It's very expensive to do a high quality. I mean, I didn't get paid, but somebody did. And I mean, the studio and all this. So I would want to do it with that kind of backing, but I'm not, it's not up to me. So I don't know.
I hear you because I do YouTube videos, so I'm familiar with the overhead costs involved in making nice things and making it in a way that other people, that people can really, the story can take shape in a fresh way. Because the way you wove the podcast together, it is your reflections. Someone on my YouTube channel wrote a comment that it was like the serial podcast. Is that what it was called?
Yeah, which looking at you, you obviously are not a real big podcast person either. I've never actually listened. Before I made the podcast, they gave me, the Hartman people gave me homework, which was to listen to 2 podcasts. And I actually listened to like about 15 minutes of one of them. So I actually don't know much about podcasts, but now I've started listening to them. And I know Serial is like a huge one. And I think the one that was the first big hit. So now I want to listen to it.
I see. For experience or because you're curious about podcasts?
Yeah, it's a whole world that opened up. I mean, it's a lot like radio, which I love. So, but it's on demand.
Yeah. And it's very well, high production value, very well put together with a lot of, I think radio doesn't get as much work and.
Yeah. Well, so there are radio documentaries that people work on for months and months and months.
That's true.
I listened to one last night.
So I want to talk more about the podcast, though. I want to talk more about the Off the Derech experience. I want to talk about maybe them one at a time. But before we do talk about the topics you talked about in the podcast, what was the reaction?
It's funny. It was. Just getting a reaction is so interesting. I mean, I think you must have this experience. Like for months, you basically did your little YouTube thing with not too many people knew that it existed, and then suddenly, right, you're famous. And I think I just thought it was going to be one of those. This is for me, so I didn't even know I would get any kind. It was hard for me to understand what kind of response I would get. And I actually got like an excellent response. People really gave me a lot of compliments, except for the first time yesterday on the little YouTube, Facebook groups, which are so close to my heart, there was a kind of explosion of criticism.
What?
And that was so hard to take. No, very valuable use, not so much useful because it's out there already, but, authentic and real. And
Where? On the Facebook group?
Yeah, on the OTD Facebook group. And those are my people, I feel so that was hard. But mostly it's been, and, people saying real things, including somebody whose parents did sit Shiva for them and
Really?
who felt invalidated by my saying, I don't know if I said exactly that it never happened or that it rarely happened, but in any case, it was hard for him to hear. And, other people with different kinds of, you don't say everybody's story, you get some things wrong, etc. It's always the criticisms that
penetrate, that touch you.
Right. And the compliments but I got a lot of compliments, and it's doing well, like your YouTube channel. And it seems like it hit some kind of nerve. I don't know, maybe the opposite of a nerve. It scratched some itch or something. I think for OTD people who are saying, wow, this is something that speaks to our own experience, more than other stuff we've heard. I think maybe especially the shunning episode and then the Nebuch episode is like, wow, that's the part where people really know nothing about that. Whereas everybody who's in the frum world or people who are OTD, they get it. And to hear that spoken about, I think was, validating. So, but other people were like, why didn't you interview this kind of person and that kind of person? And
a Baal Tshuva and a...
I did actually have a Baal Tshuva, but he didn't take up a huge space in the episode, and for whatever reason, and it was a rushed episode, the last episode. But yeah, there are definitely more things to say, and I keep thinking of more topics, and maybe you do too. I don't know.
No, I want to hear. First of all, I would say OTD people, off the derech people, we're a little bit like herding cats, right? I think everyone has very different opinions, and going there and talking about our experiences always gets people very excited about, in a negative way to some degree, about you didn't tell the story correctly because my version's different. Because we're usually independent-minded people, and everyone has such strong views about what it means to leave. And it's such a traumatic journey to uproot yourself, that the journey itself is so important to tell it correctly according to what we feel is the representation of the story. And this is why the first episode is the one I'm still thinking about. And it is the one I still don't feel like I fully have my position sussed out. I was interviewed in that episode, right? For the record, interviewed me. I had no idea what you were going to do with this podcast. When it came out, it was beautifully put together. I remember just talking to you for like a half hour. I don't know. I didn't remember even much what we talked about. But you talked about the OTD narrative and unorthodox and how much people like it, and the issue of telling the story. And I don't know. I still don't know what the issue. Like, I still don't fully understand the resistance to telling the story.
The way you put it is that you leave this world, and the world that you enter, right? This big, whatever, it's funny, we call it a world, the secular, contemporary society, they're fascinated by this story, which maybe you didn't predict. And especially if, like you and me, we live in proximity to Jewish stories, or and they want to know about you, and there's this curiosity for whatever reason that we both try to get at. And so it's as if you haven't entirely left. It was the argument that you made. You can't really leave. And this whole question of do you leave when you leave is also something that people talk about in these Facebook groups. They talk about how you're still caught up in it in various ways by using the word OTD, which is so controversial among OTD people, right?
No, explain what you mean.
So one of the things that comes up in a later episode is like, yes, I use the word OTD, and I haven't told you yet, you people who don't know this, that OTD is a contested term. There are a lot of people who hate it and who wouldn't use it about themselves. And then it not only is it a contested term, it's a kind of contested identity. There are all kinds of people who don't want anything to do with it, who just want to go away and not turn around again, like Lot's family, right? Like Lot's wife, you turn around and you become a pillar of salt. They don't want to be a pillar of salt.
So the problem is the appropriation of a negative term about ourselves.
Right. And it's also the term by which the Orthodox world discussed us as deviants, as pathological, as troubled, as however they saw this, as creating tragedy for our parents, our families. So to take that term that was directed at us as a problem and then to use it as a badge of identity is something that a lot of people don't want to do, very understandably. And it's not like I'm advocating it. I'm just using it for convenience. It's familiar. And I don't have any huge problem with it because I don't have any huge problem about this being a big thing that happened in my life. It's one of the things I talk about with Lauren. That at a certain point, I just was like, yeah, this is a big thing. She says, yes, I'm going to be talking about this for the rest of my life, and that's okay. Her wife says that to her.
About leaving the community. This is going to be a central part of her. It's going to follow her forever.
Yes. And I refuse to be embarrassed by that. I refuse to be ashamed by it. I'm not going to resist it. Doesn't mean it's going to be there every second and determine everything. But I'm also not going to try to push it away. First, you push away orthodoxy, then you push away the OTD label. So it's a complicated identity. And if you want to call it that as a kind of identity. And I think you and I are in a particular place because we've both done, we've both done very similar things, which is we've, left. That was a huge thing. And then at a certain point, we decided to, in some ways, go back to that community, not as by living as part of it, but as kind of researchers or explainers or whatever, and treat it not as the thing we had to leave, but this fascinating world on its own, which I think nobody even thought was possible, which is why it's so, I think you and I have this thing in common, which is a very big thing. And I think it's rare among OTD people. I mean, I think Izzy Posen is another person like that, where you leave and it's not the critique, it's not about a kind of ongoing critique of that community. It's more like, we understand this community in ways you never will, including its diversity, right? We're not exactly the same kind of OTD. And let us help you understand it without constantly harping on why we left.
Yeah. Maybe that's a part of it, the constantly, anytime you want to talk about the topic, it becomes, why did you leave?
If it's so great, if these people have such wonderful marriages, if the school systems are so fabulous, then why the hell can't you still be it?
Yeah.
And I personally know I can't. It's like my approach to it is made possible by the lens of the research. I don't know if you feel the same way.
I feel 100% the same way. When people ask me, are you going to go back or why did you leave? I like to turn around the question. Like I say, should I go back? Because I feel it's self-evident. I just don't, I can't. I don't fit in that spot.
I absolutely can't. I know. It's almost like a physical thing, which is funny because it's also a physical thing that I still am. You know what I mean? It's like, it's what anthropologists call habitus, like this history that's built into our bodies. People talk about it on in these Facebook groups about how, do you make a bracha before you eat your bite of cheeseburger? That's like these things that are so deep in you. And do you all the habits that we picked up that are still with us, the way our bodies actually, I mean, this idea that our bodies carry our history is part of what that term habitus means. But it's also the case that I just have an almost physical inability to be there. It's like I feel myself slinking and getting smaller, and like it's a kind of, I mean, I don't like to say it because it's rude or judgmental or whatever, but it's not something I have any control over. It's just a kind of revulsion. I just can't live in that world.
Yeah. What do you think of people who say, well, if you leave and you look back like Lut's wife, then there's something wrong with you? You know, I occasionally get messages from people who tell me that I need to go to a psychologist or something.
A psychologist is part of what you grow up thinking.
Yeah,
It's a little bit not part of our culture, right? That why? I mean, who's to say that there's something wrong with this stance? I think it's I mean, in my case, it's like, yeah, for years I didn't do it, right? I studied German literature. I didn't study Yiddish literature, which is very close, but not the same thing. And then it was like,
German literature.
What?
What did you study in German literature?
I studied, I read Kafka, I read Paul Celan, who's a Holocaust poet from Czernowitz, actually, where my mother went to school, but Jews spoke German in certain parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he was a German language poet, Jewish Holocaust poet. Really, that's who I wrote my MA thesis on. And of course, my German was basically Yiddish, But then at some point, I think it was a kind of fairly late for me. I think it took me a lot longer to realize this. At one point, I saw a poster up in the hall of the literature department that said that they were looking for college interns. I was already a grad student at that point for the Yiddish Book Center. And I thought, oh, maybe I could do this, even though I've never taken a single class in Yiddish. And I get to the Yiddish Book Center, and it was like I was being paid as an intern, which, is not that common. So I'm getting paid for this, and it was actually nice. I remember I think it was like $3,000 for the summer, which was like a huge amount of money. I don't think they do that anymore. Anyway, I get there, and I'm a superstar, right? It's like, I know Yiddish. My Yiddish wasn't that great, but I could read it. I could look at the books and tell you if it was fiction or nonfiction. And there were 5 other college interns, and most of them like barely had the aleph bays. And I just realized that in the realm of German, I'm like maybe a B+ student. I could have maybe made it. And I just move over to Jewish studies, which, required a certain amount of overcoming these various, and it's not like Jewish studies in general I know about. It's like I have a very specific education. And suddenly I have these talents that nobody else has, or that they have to acquire with great effort. It was like suddenly discovering that you're like a master juggler, the first time you try. I mean, because you've been doing it without realizing it since you were a kid. So that was my experience of like, oh my God, look at this. And every place else I have to compete. And here I am suddenly shooting to the top of the class, which I think must be a fairly common experience for people like, if Izzy decided, I mean, I know he's interested in science and philosophy, but if Izzy decided to do, I don't know, Yiddish literature, he'd also have that experience, right? And so would you.
Yeah.
And especially there's such a, almost a fetishization of people who have like Yiddish from birth,
Yeah, it's so rare. That is such a good way of putting it. It's so interesting. I mean, I don't know if I prefer juggling or speak Yiddish from birth. Maybe juggling would be a better talent. But I feel like in every realm I struggle. I have all of my issues with pushing myself forward, and I intuitively get this world. Not only I intuitively get it, but I have a very soft spot, which in my heart for it, which I think if you study something you loathe, then I think it's a very sad story for you. You're going to spend your life with a subject that you absolutely hate. And also, I think you can't really do it justice. And it puts us in such a unique position, but I think it puts the From world in a very confused place.
Yes, they don't get us.
They don't get it at all.
Yeah, I have been sort of told, I wonder if you get the same criticism. So I don't know, maybe just so I wrote a book about Beis Yaakov, as you know, but I guess I'm telling you millions of followers.
Let's do that.
Which is an Orthodox girls' school system, which you did some great work on too, which we publish anyway. And I've been told, and this was a girls' school system that I myself went to. And I don't have particularly fond memories of it. And I was interested in its history. But I've been told by various people, directly or indirectly, that in some ways I bend over backwards to be generous to it, in some ways, maybe I sentimentalize it because I am OTD. Yeah. Like I would have a sharper critical tone if I was living in that world and wanting the world to be better than it is. You know what I mean?
That is such a good point. I don't know that I get the I feel like I am more generous than I would be if I lived there, because I'm a distance away. But I also feel like, well, you know what, as a tour guide, if I was more critical, I would feel uncomfortable doing this, because I'm walking into the neighborhood, people, oh, here is the neighborhood that I think needs to really change. Like, I forgive myself for maybe.
And so do I. And in my case, I was thinking, okay, so I write a book about this Orthodox girls' school system. Who's my potential audience? I'm assuming it's probably mostly people in that world. Who else is interested? And I don't want to alienate them. And it's very possible and there are things that really annoy me, or, I mean, the piety kind of gets to me, a lot of it I'm not that into.
The piety.
So, I'm thinking about when people talk about the school, they talk about it as teaching girls Torah. And I'm more interested I'm actually probably going to continue to write about it. And I'm more interested in the fact that they also put on these crazy plays, right? That they rehearse for months and months, these extravagant performances. The performances are really amazing, even though when you get right down to it, the scripts tend to be inspirational in a way the writing is not that great, let's just be honest. But there's so much, sort of youthful energy poured into it. And so that's the part that I love about it. And then the inspirational message, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit at, or I don't, talk about that much. And this teaches you that you should all be good Jewish girls. And but until you become the good Jewish girls, you get to act the part of a rebellious Jewish girl. And that's temporarily, that's who you are. And of course, this is what, I don't know if you know who Roni Mazel is. She's a Hebrew Yiddish professor at Cal. She just got the job at Berkeley and brand new, 2 weeks. She herself is OTD, and she wrote this piece called OTD Reading in Geveb, which is a Yiddish online journal. And she basically argues that as OTD people, we always read everything wrong. We're reading whatever we're supposed to read for class. And, the story about, King David and his concubine. And we get really interested in the sex part as opposed to reading the Rashi that says she was just there to keep him warm or whatever. This OTD reading, which gets the wrong message from the story.
So
that's their idea. What?
A different message than
different message. So it's like a OTD is almost like a perspective.
Is that an OTD perspective, or is that a secular perspective? Give any secular person a story about a concubine, and they will not see the from version of that story whatsoever.
Right. Right, which I think they would find it kind of funny. It's funny because there's a Yiddish poet, Itzik Monger. I don't know if you've ever read him, fabulous poet. He calls Avishag, the concubine, he calls her King David's hot water bottle.
Oh, really?
Which is a kind of play, a secular joke on the kind of religious view of who she was.
I see.
I think this is, if I do another episode, I want to talk about this question of perspective, because it's such it's like a double perspective. It's like this, that you have two perspectives simultaneously almost.
Yeah, it's hard to hold on to both, but I think the trick is to hold on to the perspective from the inside and also understand the perspective from the outside, and to be a cultural
right.
sorts. I will say that I read your book on the Beis Yaakov movement. I felt it was extremely fair. It was an academic work. It was not in any way being I think a positive, I didn't see you bend over backwards is what I'm saying. I didn't feel it.
There is a scholar, Rachel Manikin, who says, that I think she didn't come out and say you're bending over backwards, but she said the level of education. I say somewhere in my book that I quote people who say the girls' learning is better than the boys' learning, and they're putting their brothers and their fathers to shame. I loved that. And she's like, yeah, not really.
I see.
The level was really low, and this praise that you're giving is a little over the top and whatever. I mean, she's an important, serious scholar, and I take her, and herself, I think, identifies as Orthodox. So, but maybe, and went to Beis Yaakov. So in some ways, her being identified on the inside, I think, allows her to be a little sharper.
Yeah, that's the thing. The people on the inside have a certain luxury to. I suppose that's fair. No, I think.
Yeah, and let them have it. I mean, I certainly will not want to pay the price required to have that luxury, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is just such almost a mind, excuse me, to have left and be accused of being too positive.
Right, being too positive. I'm sure I've heard people say that too about Izzy, that he's an apologist for the Orthodox world.
Really? I have seen him be more critical he's very critical on education and on several things.
It's such like how we people who are supposed to go away and don't. Like, it's almost right. We're just supposed to go away.
Exactly.
The idea that you're back in the neighborhood with your flock of tourists and I'm writing the book, and actually, people are reading it in the Orthodox world. And I've gotten, I'm actually being interviewed by an Orthodox podcast. I forget when, Wednesday, called Nishmat or Nishma, maybe like Nasev and Nishma. A rabbi who is curious on the inside, let's say, is curious to have a direct. So this is the first time that I'm really going to have a kind of direct conversation about this topic with an Orthodox person, which is so, as you know, is so rare. I don't know if you've pulled it off, but I'm moved that it's happening.
I feel like there is an extremely shocking moment where a certain bridge is. I find that my YouTube audience doesn't begin to comprehend, because a lot of people go on YouTube and they watch Hasidic stuff, Chabad stuff, which of course is a completely different story, and they're like, oh, here's more Hasidic stuff, but they don't understand this is a world that has had like a huge chasm. It's like a code of the walls are up for outsiders.
Yes.
And something is opening.
Something is opening. That's such a great way to put it. And the place where there was always the Baal Tshuva, Kirov, that kind of thing. Like, we're open to you. Come see how beautiful we are. Join us. You're doing something very different. That's new. I mean, I don't know if your viewers quite understand how amazing it is. I mean,
yeah.
Not to put them down, but how unusual this is. Pearl, who's talking to you, and I mean, my jaw is on the ground. Every time I watch this, I can't believe it's happening. And Izzy's like direct talking to Hasidic people in Yiddish. There's something shifting here.
Yeah.
To me, it's healing a big, one of the things I describe in the shunning episode is there's a don't ask, don't tell policy, right? Like, you're welcome on our terms. And do not even pretend everyone knows you're not religious. And even if they didn't know it before, they can see it in a minute just by looking at you, right? You're not going to hide it, but you don't say it, right? That's the rule. At least, yeah. I don't want to say it's everybody's rule, but it's a big part of how a lot of OTD people have made some kind of rapprochement with their families. And I literally have almost never had a conversation in which my leaving the Orthodox world has directly come up. It's so painful and so charged that it just cannot be spoken. I don't know if you have that.
Yeah. For me, this is completely new. I don't talk to my family about leaving.
No.
Yeah,
my mother once asked me if I had converted to Christianity. My world is so foreign to her.
Yeah.
That she just can't picture it. Like, I think Pearl Gluck was saying, one of her brothers came to visit her and he's like, wow, you have like a real life. Like, you have a house. I'm looking at your like beautiful, neat bookshelf and your very nice piano. Now I know made of Legos. You know what I mean? I think
my brother recently asked me, what do you do all day? You know?
I had a niece ask me if I had money.
Really?
I had another, this is back when I was like, I haven't seen these nieces and nephews for many, many years, but I had another one ask me what grade I was in when I was writing my dissertation.
Wow, really?
I was like, 23. It's just, our lives are so
foreign,
beyond their comprehension.
Yeah. And we are not in a position to articulate, in general, we are not in the position to articulate our lives. That's my experience, You don't
want to hurt, like, what Zalman said, you don't want to hurt your parents' feelings. What you want to tell them, you don't need it's so painful for them to hear. I'm always like, if I get on an airplane on Shabbos, I'm still terrified. The airplane's going to go down. And the fact that I'm going to die is like the second of my concerns. And the first of my concern is that my mother's going to find out that I was on an airplane on Shabbos.
That is a classic.
Are you the same?
I have heard crazy stories of people limping to the hospital. So for miles and miles to make sure no one knew that they got hurt, like a person in an accident on Shabbos. I don't want to give away them limping to the hospital so no one knew. They called 911 on Shabbos so their family wouldn't know. It's so
we go to great lengths. I mean, we did this horrible thing. We've devastated our families. And then we also go to great lengths to avoid hurting them further, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, many of us do.
Many. But then there's also a lot of people who feel like their families in the process of their leaving hurt them a lot.
Yes.
And I think,
and people have said that I didn't talk about that enough.
Yeah, is that how they felt? But I feel like that story is the story that has been told until now, no?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I also did talk about it a little bit, right? When I said in Nebuch, I was like, so these people say we're Nebuch and we left. And if we're not Nebuch, they make sure we're Nebuch. They make sure to destroy us. Yeah. They make sure, right? I mean, the suicides and the family custody issues where people don't see their children for 15 years. There's serious abuse in the OTD experience.
Yeah.
Not just as a feature of why people leave, but part of how OTD people are treated.
My experience is, this is my view of the community, that there's a very beautiful side, or there's a complex, robust inner world. But if you threaten it by leaving, you turn on yourself a very ugly side.
Yes.
And that ugly side is extremely valid, and it is completely fair to speak to it, you know?
Absolutely. And maybe I didn't speak to it as much as I should have. That's that instinct you have of not, there's anti-Semitism, and that part of our job is to present this world in a more human way. I mean, these people are seen as automatons, zombies, right? They're not actual human beings with personalities and differences from each other. And, it's always so funny how that community is so, and this is a slightly different topic, is so homogenized when you and I know how critical these differences are. I mean, you and I would never have had occasion really to meet or make friends, right?
Yeah. Well, thank God we left.
Yes, I thank God every day, 3 times a day, in fact.
3 times a day, really?
Well, some days I forget the second time.
You're such a good Yiddish Shamla. It's very interesting how you do justice to telling this story in a way that doesn't dehumanize. I feel that's the challenge, to tell a story that doesn't dehumanize anyone in the story. Something that I feel like is a particular part of the story, maybe is a separate subject, is the process of fighting for custody. Maybe that's where a lot of people are coming from, or maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong.
And intermarriage, right? I mean, that's, I think, when, things get pretty ugly, and that's when parents sit Shiva, and that's a big thing for sure. And certainly child custody issues. And those are, I think, the two, the ugliest parts of this. And I, mostly avoided it, not entirely, but mostly avoided it. I think partly because, the child custody thing is not my issue. I didn't have to deal with it, and you didn't either, I take it.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I mean, it's like one of these things where we don't have the same exact experience. We don't have.
Of course. No.
And yet it's such a huge thing to have in common, right? I mean, it's like such a huge thing to have in common with somebody. I mean, people don't generally have such a big thing in common with anyone else. I mean, you can be interested in the same sports team, or you could have gone to the same college. Like, none of it at least in my experience, none of it gets as deep as having this thing in common.
Having leaving
OTD in common, right?
Out of a community. It is an incredibly strong bond.
Even though we're all mavericks or whatever, we're all different, and when we were religious in such different ways that people don't get, but that means something to us, right?
Yeah. Like, I think you said it, there's sort of a competition of what
I want to do an episode on this at some point, I think.
Go ahead.
On the differences, maybe I'll just say it. So like, for those of you out there in YouTube landia, Frieda and I have this very, like, I grew up what's called, even though my father was Hasidic, we grew up, I would say, more typically yeshivish, and then Hasidic, and I spoke Yiddish, but also English, and I don't know whether that's true of you. And we had cousins that were Pupa, which is very similar to Satmar, but we ourselves were not thought of them as like the crazy fanatics. And my father shaved his beard and had a PhD and worked in the city. So we had this, like, in my mind, worldly life. And I was always attracted to people who were, like, to the left of us religiously, and disgusted by people to the right of us. Like, slightly freaked. We spent time in Williamsburg with my Pupper family I lived with them for a summer. I spent the summer in Williamsburg, which is the name of a. So that's my kind of, let's say, Orthodox profile, and yours is different than, let's say, 2 or 3 degrees to the right, or maybe 12 degrees.
How do we measure degrees?
Right, and that might not seem like anything to the outside world, and yours is the community that gets represented most often in these leaving Orthodox tales, whereas mine barely exists in the popular imagination. And yet in the OTD world, I feel like you have a certain kind of status and glamour, like Izzy, because you came from Satmar, which is like the famous strict one.
Yeah. The more strict, the more like scar
what points you get when you leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the OTD board game. And if you also change your gender on the way out, if you're trans, then you get like more double bonus points.
There is kind of a survivor. I think this goes for a lot of war stories in general, people who go through hard things. It becomes a competition for who has survived more.
Right. Like, oh, your parents got out in 1939. What are you even doing here in the support group?
Get out.
Lightweight. That's how I feel about people who like are modern Orthodox and who left. I'm like, really? I mean, I won't say that to their faces, but I'm like, really? You need our support.
It's interesting because it's a flattening, actually. It is ultimately reducing it to how strict it was. But if your family was very strict but maybe functional, then I think you probably
are there some like that?
What?
Are there any like that?
Oh, are there any ever? Right. Yeah, you know what, something I was left thinking about with the podcast, the whole shunning thing. You also have a son. I don't know if that's something that you have to think about, but I always kind of was like, well, I left. I'm trying to keep a relationship with my family. My family's trying. I am trying. I'm very grateful. I'm invited to all the events. Not that I go to, I'm sure you know, there are about 1 million.
But there's like bar mitzvah every Thursday and Monday. And then there's a bris every other Tuesday. And then there's now yurtzats, and there's constantly something. My mother's like, if I catch her at home, it's amazing, right? Oh, really? I mean, now she's not going out so much. My mother has COVID for the second time. She's 100 years old. How old? 100? My mother turned 100 in August. Bless her. How's she doing with COVID? You should interview her. She lives alone. People leave her food on the outside of her door. But she's getting over COVID. Oh. Hopefully she's getting over. Every morning I gotta like call her. Wow. Hopefully she'll be better. Yeah. She's already better-ish. So I'm wishing her a refuah shalema. Thank you, dear. Yeah, get well soon. So back to the issue of shunning. Are you worried that can we talk about you? Yeah, I love, by the way, that you started the sentence and I felt like you didn't have to finish it. Why? What was I saying? I think what you're saying is, it's not just us who have this complicated situation with the shunning, it's also our children. Exactly. Where are their cousins? Where are their, if they were still in that world, my only son, you also have an only son, would have, I don't know, 100, 200 cousins. We're talking about first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, then we're getting into the hundreds for sure. Right? What these families are like. And instead he has, nothing really. He doesn't, he has cousins on the other side, but my son's bar mitzvah happened, you'll know this is no great coincidence, the same day as my brother's third son's bar mitzvah. So, and my mother had a conflict of the bar mitzvahs of her grandsons. Wow. Yeah, so we actually were like, we'll move ours. We're fine with that. I think the rule is that the right of way goes to the person who stole from.
That's true. They don't have the
Traffic rules in these situations. I mean, I was surprised that my mother came, but yeah, we did ours on
the West Coast.
my mother came to Berkeley for my son's bar mitzvah, which was 12 years ago. She was whatever, 88.
Wow.
And she brought my son the only things they have from Europe, not from before the Holocaust. They don't have anything from that really, but from after. The first candlesticks, they're not beautiful silver candlesticks. They're made out of china. And she gave them to my son. And when I said, how can you give it to us? And my mother said, when I'm gone, I don't know if your siblings will have anything to do with you, and I want you to have this.
Oh,
That's what she said. Yeah, my mother's
want your
really,
siblings to be connected to you?
she wishes, yeah. She's actually brought me over to them when they didn't want me to be there. So my mother is really sad that some of my siblings have shunned me.
Even though she's your world is so foreign to her that she would think you converted to Christianity.
Exactly.
She would accept you even if hypothetically.
She did accept me, even though she wasn't sure.
Wow.
My mother, one time I was at my mother's house, and my aunt, who's 98 years old, I mean, this was a while ago, she came over and she said to my mother in Yiddish, I didn't know Naomi would be here. I wouldn't have come if I'd known. And my mother said out loud in English, as if just to make sure that my aunt understood, that I understood. She said, it's not too late to leave.
Wow.
To her own sister.
Wow.
As we're talking about a very Hasidish woman, my mother, and her sister, who's a Belzer Chassid.
Your mother lives in Borough Park, and
well, I grew up in Borough Park. Now my mother lives in Flatbush on East 13th and between J and K.
Gotcha. You know what shocks me also in this story, besides for your mother standing up for you, is that your aunt would speak in Yiddish as if in code switching to secret language. Well, she knows you speak Yiddish.
It's this weird thing where people, you must have experienced this, where people think you don't understand Yiddish anymore. Has this happened to you?
Yes, I know.
All the time, right? My mother will say something like, instead of in the Yiddish accent, she'll like turn it into like modern Israeli Hebrew, as if that's the language I speak. Like, I'm like, Ma, you don't have to do that. I mean, I understand you perfectly well in your native tongue. So yeah, there's this weird disconnect. It's like like I look like even though I put on a skirt when I visit my mother, obviously, there's this like she can't get her mind over the chasm, and she translates for me as if I need the translation.
That is so interesting that there's such a deep code switching. Insider, we talk one way, and outsider another way.
Exactly. I heard Zalman say, I wanted to come home for Shabbat. I'm like, you didn't say Shabbat. Come on, Zalman.
It's sometimes we participate in.
Yeah. And it happens to me all the time. I'm like halfway through a sentence. I'm Hasidic, right? What's the word Hasidic?
Yeah. Well, the truth is, my mother would never even say Hasidic. She would say Heimish. She wouldn't say Hasidic Jew. Yeah. So whenever I say Hasidic.
I don't know. Maybe my mother would say that too. I'm not sure.
Yeah. We use language that might be in some ways it tells us apart as outsiders. But it's so interesting that your own mother would speak English to sort of she was making a statement. I want her to understand, but everyone knew you speak Yiddish.
Yeah. I mean, it's true that my aunt was saying it in a soft voice, but I heard perfectly well.
I see. I guess it fascinates me how language serves to create insider-outsider boundaries.
I've had people like, do you ever go into the I'm sure you do, like talk Yiddish to a little Hasidic kid running around, a little Heimish kid running around, and they look at you and they're like trying to figure out, like they can't, it's not just that they can't tell, are you an insider or outside? They can't tell if you're male or female. They can't tell if you're Jewish or non-Jewish. They're like, you've just scrambled their brains to such a huge extent. I actually used to really enjoy doing that.
I feel bad for the kids. I never do it. I speak English because I feel bad. It seems like it's so destabilizing to them.
They stare, like the stares that you get.
Yeah.
Right. There's something about that stare. I guess children stare, but also like this idea that, yeah, I mean, just the stares from, people, that family, like, they're like, how are you part of our family? Like when you do go back, right?
Yeah.
Like what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Or I'm sure when they look at your kid.
Exactly.
And then also like what it is for the kid to feel like this is my family, and yet I register as an outsider. Like that registering as an outsider is among the more painful things about, I don't know if you have this experience, this maybe could be another episode, like when you're in the airport and see a Hasidic family and they're totally like in their own world and they see you as an outsider, like there's no, and you have this like, but I'm not an outsider. Like you somehow want to signal, or maybe there's like a little girl and you want to go, if you ever want to leave, here I am, I'll rescue you.
I have that in the sense, my mother tells me when she's on the subway, my mother is very afraid of the trains. I'm, of course, not at all afraid of the trains. It's like this Hasidic thing. You go in on the subway, and my mother tells me she always looks for another Hasidic person, and she stands next to them just in case. I'm on the subway all the time, but if I see another Hasidic person, I feel this intimacy. Oh, here's another Heimische person. Was machst, how are you doing? And then it registers immediately that to them, the bond my mother forms with a stranger on the train isn't formed for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a way of, and you've chosen to move in the larger sphere that doesn't have these little pockets of intimacy.
Yeah, exactly.
And those pockets of intimacy, they were hell for a certain moment in my life, for sure. But they also, in some way, they're intimate. And there isn't enough intimacy in life.
Yeah, that is so true. Also, I was once on the train on Shabbos and there was a Hasidic person. And I was and that is not so pleasant.
What did you do? What did you say?
I was thinking to myself, ooh, I'm gonna follow him and find out what he's up to. And then
it's obvious what he's up to. Come on. I mean, have you ever been to a movie and there's a Hasidic person there sitting without his yarmulke?
Yeah.
I mean, this is how people survive, right? They take these little vacations.
Yeah, and it's not fair of me. That's what I didn't follow that person. I thought to myself, that is so not fair of me to judge, like just because this person's clothing strikingly said they're not supposed to be on the train doesn't mean it's my business. But it was my instinct. I have gossipiness also in my DNA.
Nosiness. I think it's built into the DNA, right? That combination of nosiness and love.
Yeah, right? Two sides of the same coin.
The nosy love, the big noses. That's what it's really about.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
should I let you go?
I don't know. I mean, how much patience do people have out there in YouTube land to listen to you?
I'm not editing it. We're just talking about this topic from a very different perspective. What's been really interesting for me lately is I've been talking about intermarriage to all sorts of Jewish people. It's just been on my mind, marrying, especially men marrying non-Jewish women, and I've been talking to people in the Frum community, and it's so interesting to see people talk about that, because I think it's like when it happens to your own family, it is so devastating. But when it happens to others, there's maybe a little more willingness to almost like, well, if you left, that's what's going to happen.
Right.
Almost like an acceptance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I remember one of the very rare conversations I had with one of my sisters about leaving. And she said, well, okay, it's one thing for you to leave, but how about your children? Are they going to be Jewish? Like you're basically on the path to the disappearance of the Jewish people, which they understand to be, the way they understand to be it. And I remember one of my thoughts was like, is that what this is about? Like, why didn't somebody tell me that? Like, I thought it was about Hashem gave, turns out it has nothing to do with Hashem. Like, what does Hashem have to do with this? This is just this kind of like the persistence of the Jewish people, which is a secular concept that I haven't gotten past. I do think it's a beautiful thing, right? Like this Jewish difference. And I have in some way, ruled it out for my kid, even though he went to a Jewish day school. And, you know what that means, not much, let's just say.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think they're right? The Frum community is right in that you can only choose one or the other?
I mean, on some level, the best thing that Jews have going, I mean, I know this is a crazy thing to say, but the best thing they have going is OTD. Like, ideally, what you have is you have this crazy lifestyle that's impossible to leave. I mean, impossible to live in. That was an interesting, both are true, I guess, of which the, most interesting, if not the smartest people, okay, maybe that's a little bit self-serving here, leave. And the Jewish culture that's produced at that particular scene, that's the best thing, right? And if you think about, Shai Agnon, I mean, he remained Orthodox, but Bialik and, Devar Baron, and we're the great Jewish writers, or the interesting art and the stuff you're doing.
You're
right?
far too generous, Naomi.
I think what you're doing, I mean, it's true that, lots of people are picking up on it. Even the extent that you're having this kind of success now, I think it's bigger than that. I think what you're doing is, it's not just that you're providing an inside glimpse at the, ultra-Orthodox world. Maybe we shouldn't use that term, ultra-Orthodox, way too Orthodox world. For liberal Jews and secular Jews and non-Jews, et cetera. It's not just that, it goes beyond that. It talks about a new kind of sensibility at this scene that I'm thinking of, a new possibility for a kind of world perspective that to me is so, even if what you're doing is going, oh, look at this store, or having a conversation about Hashem, I see something so big in it. I think other people do too. And I think it's so moving to me, and it's so rich, and it's such a new way of being in the world. And when you think about how many chasms there are, right, between right and left, and this is a particularly deep one, let's just say. It's also a political chasm, right? Because so many of those people are on the political right as well as on the religious right. And to embody this possibility the way you do it's existential. And
well, thank you. I appreciate this. This interview was not supposed to be about me. It's supposed to be about you. But actually, I feel like your podcast, having had the success that it has, also with the Frum community, right? A lot of Frum people listen to it.
A little bit, yeah. I think I'm not 100% sure. It's always interesting to me. I mean, in some ways, I was a little bit nicer to the Frum community than I was to the secular Jews. I feel like there's such a target and a foil.
Yeah.
Somebody, actually a Frum woman, said to me, you're so obnoxious to these, right? It's like when the secular Jews, like, first we're too Frum for them, then we're too atheist for them, or too, in your face, or
that you're too obnoxious. You're so obnoxious to
liberal Jews. Yeah. And I think, including the people who sponsored this podcast, right? This obnoxiousness that you get from being Frum, and then that's the word we use. And then when you leave, you leave the identification with the Frumkeit, but you don't leave the obnoxious snobbery, I think, entirely. You maintain that kind of, which is why I think, the question that people ask me, like, so, okay, you don't want to be, we actually davened in the Satmar Stiebel. I think I told you that. You don't want to go to that kind of shul because you can't see the men's section, whatever. Come to a modern Orthodox or join a conservative shul. Like, that's the reasonable thing to do. Like, they just don't understand this way of being, which a lot of it is class related, right? It's a lot of it has to do with that whole modern Orthodoxy. I mean, the big part of, modern Orthodoxy is not just like a different level of religiosity. It's a whole class, the whole bourgeois class that, we're poor Jews, most of us who grew up from, relatively speaking, I don't know about your family, we were definitely poor. So to grow up a poor Jew who was really Jewish and really poor, that's kind of like an oddity in the upper middle class Jewish world.
Yeah. I was modern Orthodox for a while, so I know I felt extremely out. Like there was a snobbery.
You probably couldn't afford it.
I couldn't afford it. No, I couldn't afford it at all. I was broke completely. The entire
Where the neighborhoods you have to live in, the fancy schools that your kids go to,
and all the sports, you have to live on so many levels when you're modern Orthodox.
It's exhausting.
Yeah. But the whole idea of creating a spectrum of Frumkeit and you have to fit yourself somewhere on it is, to me, your spectrum you created. Like, I live with a different spectrum. I live on a spectrum of screen culture, and I actually don't have a smartphone because I picked somewhere in the middle. So maybe I'm in the middle by my spectrum. Because people constantly ask me, why do you go all the way? I didn't go all the way. I went in the middle on subjects that I care about. I actually am going to do a Q&A now for my YouTube channel. I asked people to ask me questions, and that was one of the questions. Why not settle?
Oh my God, that's always the question. So there's two questions. One question is, why do you have to go all the way? And as if the normal, reasonable, neutral, vanilla choice is, for some people, modern Orthodoxy, for some people, conservative, as if that isn't a cultural thing of its own. And then the other question is, why do you think you're so special?
Is that what people say?
I've gotten that. That came up in that first episode with Zalman. It's like, yeah, of course people are curious. Why shouldn't they be? Like, get over yourself. We are special. Sorry. Look, obviously, I think we're special, right? I just said it to you.
Of course. Everyone is special.
Everyone's special, but maybe we're just a little more special.
I think charting your own path is something very special because it often comes with paying a very big price. It's often easier to not do that. And there's something people find inspirational about that. And I feel like that's fair. I have sometimes when I went through a hard time in my life, look back at my own life and thought, well, I have been through that, then I can go through this, So I've drawn inspiration from my own life. So I feel like there's something to be said. I've had moments in my life that I was very not proud of myself. Like, I don't think, oh, look at me, I've done great. I think there have been moments that I did good, that I stood up to the challenge. And yet, when people ask me to tell my story, my whole skin crawls.
We didn't do it, did we? Sort of, a little bit, no?
Did we tell our stories?
Not really.
No. I don't mind talking about it. That's the interesting thing. I'm not a private person. I'm completely comfortable with my gut.
I have no boundaries, clearly, which is weird that I have like this one little, sorry. I guess I have some, but yeah, the telling. On the other hand, you wrote a memoir. Do people know that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that came out of the pressure to do so. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like the memoir is something. It's like, yeah, you want to hear my story? Sit down and read a 300-page book.
Yeah.
If you're going to do that, okay. like, hear it. Don't get the potted version of whatever, the dinner party or the whatever. Like that part is the lie. It's got to be a 300-page story.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the issue.
The lack of nuance when you're telling the abbreviated.
Right. And I always feel myself cutting away edges.
I'm so sorry. See, that's my flip phone.
Did you hear like the doggies and the housemaid?
Yeah, I heard the dog. They're dogs.
One is ours and one is our housemaid who walked by 20 minutes ago.
Ah, yeah. I've heard of the second dog. So sorry.
He's actually the one with the Yiddish name, Mushkala.
Mushkala?
But we call him Mooch.
Mooch. Wow.
He's a mooch. Mushkala, Pushkala. Mushkala. Oh, there's the housemate. What do you say?
Muchkala Puchkala.
Muchkala Puchkala. Oh, very clever. It's been like years since he got his full name treatment. That's only when he's being very, very bad that he gets the full name.
Oh, really? The whole Mushkala Puchkala. I love it.
What were the Yiddish endearments that you got called? I was Shefala all the time.
Yeah, Shefala.
Or Shefala, would you say?
Meshumala.
Neshumala. I never was Neshumala, which is reasonable since I lack a soul.
Since you what? You lack a soul.
Lack a soul.
No, you have a huge soul. You have You are the kindest person. Something that I love about your podcast is your conversation with everyone opens up. I think that's part of the key to the success. That everyone opens up to you because you so let people open up to you. It's a wonderful thing.
Wow, thank you. Well, how about you? With you, it's like you're talking to, Hamish grandmothers.
To what?
The grandmothers, Pearl, and
oh.
And you actually had a conversation about Hashem, and she's not giving you a hard time for not being from, huh?
She is lovely. This is actually also something I want to talk to you about. I was going to ask you your thoughts on me not dressing from when I'm in the community, because this is something
oh my God, I just look at you and I go, right the fuck on. I mean, I just love that you don't play that game. And it would be so easy to do it. And I'm sure in some ways it would make your life easier. And then I'm looking at Pearl and she's like having a conversation with you and you're wearing pants and you're wearing red, right? Right at the moment when she's saying that's the one color we don't wear. And you bring it up and the conversation continues. I always wonder about the people, whatever the 12,000 people that watch it in the first 20 minutes after it comes out, like whether they understand, just how huge that is.
Yeah. That's why it's huge for me. As you said, a lot of people will criticize me, tell me don't walk around with pants or whatever. But I feel like a fraud if I feel like I wear a costume. And I also feel like I can't be myself if I'm in the costume.
Exactly. Oh my God, exactly.
I don't get any gratification from wearing clothing like pants. Like it doesn't make me feel like, oh, let me make myself attractive to Pearl. It's not. It's rather I come on my terms. Please let me come on my terms. And the fact that she extends that generosity is, I think,
right. You've ruled out, let's say, 95% of the people in that world by that move, and you found the few. And that's a big thing already. It doesn't have to be everybody, right? There's like, Isaac Schoenfeld, Yitzhak Schoenfeld in the podcast, right? He's my Pearl.
Explain.
Isaac Schoenfeld is this. I mean, this is one reason to really look at Orthodox Jews as individuals. Here's this guy, he's totally from, lives in Borough Park, in the heart of Borough Park. If you looked at him, you'd see just another, I guess he's yeshivish. I don't even exactly know what his flavor is. And he's just,
Yiddish, no?
What?
He speaks Hasidic Yiddish.
Yeah, does he?
I think so. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. I usually speak English to him. So, I mean, what other kind of Yiddish would he be speaking? I mean, my brother speaks a Litvish Yiddish, which is not what he heard growing up. And Isaac is this very unusual person, but he's made a whole. I mean, he's you from the other direction. He's a frum guy who has decided that he will have no judgment about OTD. He will live the life he does, and he will accept people who leave. And this isn't just in his own personal mind. He's created a space in which this, let's call it the suspension of judgment, is the guiding principle, which is this kind of roving. Have you ever been to Cholent?
No, I haven't.
Oh my God, you have to do a podcast there.
Yeah.
Or YouTube. Oh, it's an amazing scene. I mean, it's not as amazing as it was. You know, people always say that about Burning Man or whatever. There were times in the history when it was like 300-400 people on a Thursday night with the party starting at 11 o'clock at night. And in one room, there's some crazy group of Rastafarian ex-Lubavitchers, you know, doing something. In another room, there's an academic like me giving a talk. And in another room, there's a bunch of, you know, people doing drugs. And there's, you know, the saint, the angel, the patron saint of it all, Isaac Schoenfeld, going from space to space to space, making people feel comfortable and taking care of people who are crying. And because there's always, you know, crisis and mental illness and whatever. And that's who he is. And he's created this.
He doesn't get social repercussions for what he's done.
He's known, and the existence of, let's call it an escape valve, is known. And it's to this extent, so far, so good. Right now, it's actually, weirdly enough, it's in the basement of my brother-in-law's shul in Flatbush, which is called the Flatbush Minyan. My brother-in-law is kind of open-minded, and they have the space, so it happens there. And now it's like maybe 25 people and some people on Zoom, and there's a blanket on the floor, and somebody gives a little psychedelic Dvar Torah, and then somebody else plays the guitar, and then it's much smaller than it used to be since the pandemic and even before. But the repercussions. So, you know, when people talk about Isaac, they see him as. I mean, I think they understand. This is another thing that people don't understand, is the existence of these middle positions, like places like Airmont. Like now the Orthodox world is so big, the Hasidic world is so big, and there have to be these places where a little steam can be let off, where if your wife, you know, wants to go to college, you will not be excluded from, you know, you'll find a place to go to shul. So that's what Airmont is, I take it. I don't know. I've never been. So people understand that Isaac is somebody who allows for a certain kind of permission. And I think in the bottom, the acceptance has to do with, well, maybe if people have a little place to blow off steam, they won't leave entirely or something. So he hasn't been. Maybe there are people who shun him, but mostly he's been fairly well accepted.
Wow.
And so that's a beautiful thing too. I mean, also he sort of flies a little below the radar. And I think that the world in some ways is more open. There are more of these little areas of openness than there used to be. I know about this like little scene in Lakewood, New Jersey, which has like a little bit of a hippie vibe to it, with they stay up and play guitar and maybe smoke dope. And
men and women?
Men, only men. You know why? Because there's a lot of kids in that world. So, you know, smoking dope, if you've got like 8 kids to put to sleep.
Dope is what's dope?
Marijuana.
Oh, marijuana is dope?
I don't know. Maybe that's what it used to be called. It's also the word for heroin, no?
I thought so. Yeah. But anyway, now pot is everywhere in New York City.
Yeah. And certainly there's lots of Hasidim, you know, getting high, and ayahuasca and all kinds of little. I mean, that's what happens when a world gets this big, is that there are pockets.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not what it was when I was growing up.
No, that's something I discussed actually with Pearl. It was interesting to talk to her. Hopefully we'll get to edit the second part. And she was saying there was no such thing as OTT people in her day. You know, whoever left. That was it. You never heard from them again. They disappeared. It was in or out. That was it.
In or out, right? And now there's us, or whatever we are.
Yeah, it's interesting the way it's changing, and it'll keep changing. You have to keep doing the podcast because it'll help not only chart the change, put a sort of identify a certain place and time. When things change so fast, you need to preserve it, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, any last thing you want to say? Can we promote your work? And is there anything lastly you want to say?
Sure. I don't know. Listen to the podcast, get in touch. A lot of people have, kind of oddly, just sent me an email. I don't know. What do you say? Like and subscribe?
Yeah. Yeah, please check out Heretic in the House. Lovely podcast where Naomi does such a beautiful job talking about all sorts of facets in such a fair and compassionate and human way. I feel like
I love how you pronounce human. That's the correct way to pronounce it, everybody. And if you like Frieda, she's the star of episode 1 and appears periodically in other episodes.
I appreciate being part of it. Whenever you do more, you have to invite me.
Oh my God, for sure. Maybe you and me together.
Yeah, awesome. Well, our next thing we're going to do together is going to be something in person, visiting the Beis Yaakov places.
I can't wait. I can't wait.
All right. Thank you so much.
Mwah!
All right. Thank you.